Good day, my name is Mpho. I will be presenting the paper that is co-authored with Mr. Mente. The topic of our presentation is Conceptual Competence in Homicide Investigations, where we were looking at practitioners' understanding of core forensic principles and why it matters for investigative integrity, evidential reliability, and the pursuit of justice. Forensic science has advanced technically, yet the conceptual foundation underpinning investigative practices remain critically under-examined. Misinterpretation of principles that distort evidence, compromise investigation, and undermine legal outcomes. So we looked at laboratory procedures that talks to DNA analysis, processing that dominate scholarly attention. There is conceptual neglect where practitioners' understanding of foundational principles such as the Locard principles, identification, and individualization is rarely studied empirically. And then in homicide investigations, conceptual errors directly affect investigative sequencing, evidence interpretation, and prosecutorial outcomes. So this study focused on or explored 5 core principles that are used under investigation. We looked at the Locard exchange principles, which posits that every contact leaves a trace and practitioners must interpret the how, why, and under what conditions transfer occurred. We looked at identification and individualization, where there is distinguishing of class characteristics from unique identifiers is central to accurate suspect inference. We also looked at criminal and forensic investigation, where confusion between these aims affects investigative sequences and strategic decision making. We also looked at systems and interpretivism, where practitioner knowledge is shaped by organizational structures, experience, and social context. The 3 complementary frameworks provide a comprehensive length for analyzing conceptual competence in homicide investigation. The Locard exchange principle explains the scientific basis for face evidence and transfer dynamics. The system theory highlights how organizational structures, training, and resources shape practitioner knowledge, and the interpretivist framework reveals how meaning is constructed through experience, peer influence, and context. So in this study, we followed a qualitative study where semi-structured interviews were conducted with 36 participants across the 3 operational roles, including the investigating officers, the forensic analyst, and the crime scene experts. The key findings of this study in terms of crime scene and conceptualization and management are that there is narrow scene definitions, where 33% defined a crime scene simply as the place where the crime occurred, and there is no participants who reference the primary and secondary classification, microscopic versus macroscopic scenes, or behavioral typologies. They only define crime scene simply as a place where crime occurred, and then participants emphasize barricade tape and single entry points, but omitted layered security, multi-zone control, and formal scene entry protocols. And then in terms of experience over protocol, we found that descriptions reflected operational intuition rather than the structured management frameworks because no participant mentioned formalized scene management models. And then the key findings in terms of DNA contamination and examination was that in terms of contamination awareness, 39% of the participants defined contamination as external DNA mixing with evidence. Participants identified direct sources like touching, coughing, but they neglected indirect pathways such as secondary transfer, tool contamination, or airborne mechanisms. And then in terms of examination practices, participants recognize the importance of initial walkthroughs and the avoiding disturbance of evidence. However, no participants reference structured search patterns, the grid, the spiral, or the zone-based approaches commonly prescribed in forensic literature. Environmental challenges, particularly outdoor DNA degradation, were acknowledged, but they were not systematically addressed. Only 6% of the participants recognized storage-related contamination risk, indicating a significant gap in long-term DNA integrity awareness. The key findings in terms of access control and DNA preservation was that in terms of scene definition, 33% of the participants defined a crime scene simply as the physical location of the offense. 39% in terms of contamination provided accurate definition of DNA contamination as unwanted mixing of biological material. And then in terms of preservation gaps, 58% of the participants gave only vague responses about DNA preservation without specifying the required procedures. And in terms of the storage risk, 6% recognized that improper long-term storage may contribute to DNA contamination or deterioration. So while participants understood basic access control and preservation principles, air drying, paper packaging, PEE usage, knowledge of full preservation sequence was inconsistent. Few participants mentioned avoiding plastic packaging, temperature control, or timely laboratory submissions. Across all thematic areas, participants demonstrated practical, experience-based knowledge, but they lacked formalized theory-driven understanding. From a systems theory perspective, these gaps reflect not merely individual shortcomings, but broader organizational challenges such as training deficiencies, inconsistency protocol, and insufficient resources. Conceptual competence is not solely an individual attribute. It is a systematic product of organizational structures, training models, and institutional practices. So in this study, we're recommending the following. They should strengthen training and competency. They should integrate crime scene management, contamination control, and DNA preservation into certified training programs. They should be standardized procedures where they develop and enforce clear standing operational procedures supported by practical checklist of evidence handling. They should also align policy with international standards where they harmonize national practices with global guidelines and require contamination incidents reporting. They should also invest in system support where they provide modern equipment, dedicated scene management rules, and digital chain of custody systems. So DNA evidence reliability is not only a technical issue, it is a system-wide challenge that begins at the crime scene. Strengthening practitioner competence both at scientific and ethical responsibility is encouraged. So In conclusion, effective crime scene management is essential for DNA evidence integrity. The current challenges are systematic, not only individual mistakes. Improving training procedures and coordination can strengthen forensic outcomes, and a structured, integrated approach can enhance investigations and justice delivery. Improving crime scene practices is not only a technical need, but a critical step toward ensuring justice and safer communities. Thank you so much for joining us at today's online presentation. That brings us to the end of our presentation.